Hi, this is James Sayer, and this is episode 25 of The Breakdown. That's right, episode 25. And tonight, we're going to be following up on some of the topics from the previous episode. We're going to be talking a little bit more about some of the things the Biden administration has been doing, some of the things that are good that we really like, and some of the things that we're not happy about or that could be better. We're going to talk about all those. We're going to get to that and some other topics as well. They're all sort of interrelated, so you'll kind of see us go through a range of different topics, but they do tend to relate to one another, and that's why we're trying to delve deeply, but also go broadly as well, and make connections between seemingly disparate or separate topics, and show the actual connections and influences and impacts between them and upon each other. But first, some corrections. I made a number of errors, mostly just, fumbles of speech, as I tried to rattle off, what I was trying to say over the course of 2.5 hours, on the last marathon episode. So I'll just list them out. I'd already, tweeted out to some followers that I'd made a number of errors, when I misspoke. Didn't get the data wrong, just said it wrong. So I'm going to go sort of acknowledge my mistakes, full disclosure, what I goofed. Hopefully you had some chuckles at seeing my very obvious mistakes. The first correction regarding when I was talking about Derek Chauvin's sentencing. First time I correctly said that he was sentenced for second-degree murder, but then I incorrectly followed up saying he had been sentenced for second-degree manslaughter, which is not true. He's convicted for second-degree manslaughter and for, I think, third-degree murder. But you're only sentenced for the most severe crime, which is second-degree murder, according to the state law in Minnesota. So Chauvin was sentenced to second-degree murder, but I misstated it a couple times. So my bad there. Also, the other mistake I made was Trump's attorney at the second impeachment trial. One of the attorneys was Bruce Castor, and he was a former prosecutor, and he's the one who goofed, essentially promising immunity to Cosby that his testimony wouldn't be used against him in a prosecution, and it was. So Pennsylvania Supreme Court overturned that. So that's Bruce Castor made that call. So I just wanted to identify him. I'd forgotten his name, but he's the attorney for the second impeachment trial for Trump, one of the attorneys. And then there's one instance when I was talking about the situation in the Senate, and I said the situation was so bipartisan. Obviously, it was a mistake. I'm going to say it was so partisan, extremely partisan, historically so. And then I had also mentioned how, in a certain sense, the Republicans failing to support the American Rescue Plan, which had over $300 billion for police officers and funding across the country, that by them all in unison not voting for that rescue plan, that they were in a sense voting to defund the police. Now that's not completely accurate. That's being used figuratively. They're delaying funding for the police. They have no intention of denying funding for the police at all, but they're not above delaying it for political purposes. And we've seen that before when Republicans have delayed funding for first responders, to pay for their medical bills, for first responders who are still suffering from the effects of responding to 9/11. So we've seen them drag their feet and play politics with people's lives before, and so we've seen them sort of play politics with people's lives and not voting for the very needed American Rescue Plan. And that includes the very needed funding for police departments. But I had incorrectly said that the police voted to defund the police, and I meant to say the Republicans voted to defund the police. But that's, not really true. They're just, they weren't going to vote for funding for that police in that package, right? And they're not willing to vote for any Democratic sponsored legislation at all at this point. Hopefully we might be able to get some compromise on an infrastructure bill, but that's in question as well. So anyway, that was another mistake I made. And then I was talking about the need for police and the need for dangerous people, people who have to be able to use force to protect us. and to defend us and to enforce our laws. That sometimes they need to be as hard can be to do so, that we need people that are of that mentality. And I said get hard, people that can get as hard can be, and that has a very different connotation, obviously. So that was my other misspeak, haha. So I hope you enjoyed that. So I'm acknowledging that goof up as well. So those are the big ones. There are probably some other ones too, but I just want to acknowledge those. Those are my screw ups for the marathon episode. I always make a few, but that was more than usual. But those being acknowledged, we shall move on to the subjects at hand. I did want to pick up on a few topics very briefly before we start moving into our analysis, our final analysis of regarding Joe Biden from last week. There were a number of topics I didn't cover quite as much regarding what he's been doing, both in good and bad ways, and I wanted to give that more fair treatment. I think it deserves it. And also, but there were some other issues as well that I thought related to it that were also equally as relevant. So we're going to kind of go through them. And my notes are in much better shape tonight, so I should be much more organized in the approach. Anyway, I mentioned Pol Pot in the previous episode, and what I was talking about there was what I was really trying to get at was that whether it's a supposed communist, right, whether it purports to be a communist, someone purports to be, a communist, or their regime is communist, or if they purport to be fascist or nationalist or whatever, that often these dictatorial approaches, because communist and what we see in the countries that claim to be communist, and what we see to countries that are thought of more typically as authoritarian or fascist authoritarian, like the far right versus the far left, right? And we think in terms of, well, they're at opposite ends, but in many, many ways, their dynamics are very similar, in that they both rely on violent oppression of specific groups of people. And they basically steal and oppress from one group, one constituency, and take that and reward the other constituency, their favored one, for support and for going along with it. So if you're talking about fascists, usually it's like, well, they reward the business community, they reward the more conservative part of the community, right? And the other people who go along with their plans, right? The workers, anyone who resists, the liberals who stand up for human rights, they get the crunch hard. And nobody stands in their way, right? In fascism, there's no protections for individual rights. The state and the dictator have virtually unlimited power to impose order however they see fit. And you see the similar dynamic in communism. There's no protections really for individuals or for minority groups. The strict definition of communism, and this is an interesting minor digression, is that true communism, as envisioned by Marx, which is ultimately unachievable, it's more of a utopian ideal than it's actually accomplishable in reality, requires that there be no money, right? That you don't use money in a communist society, and it is completely democratic. It is a democratic society. And, it is a communist society where things are divided up evenly, with some variance, right? The whole thing about each according to their ability and each according to their need. But that there's a very even distribution in the ideal, but that it's democratically decided. But that's a majority, right? That's 51%, right? The other 49%, if that's how many oppose, they just get run right over. There's no real built-in protections of the individual necessarily in the communist society as it's been designed. But in reality, no one's ever practiced. All the regimes that have called themselves communist have not been. Pol Pot's regime was not democratic, nor was the Soviet Union. They called themselves the Democratic Soviet Socialist Republic, but they were neither democratic nor were they socialist, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And so that's a precondition for being communist. One, there's no money at that stage in development, right? And all countries on earth have used money, especially within modern times. And their communism may have existed in small communities in jungles somewhere. That is possible, where people don't use money and they decide things democratically. And something reflecting Marx's conception of communism could have actually existed, and it may still, but that's about it. No large-scale society can function in that fashion, or would we want it to, right? That's the thing. One of the cherished things about the United States and a lot of other democracies, liberal democracies, is that liberal component. And what that means is not liberal in the sense of, I want to help the poor and spend more money on, economic programs to help, inequality and, more environmental protections, but liberal in the sense of, belief in classic liberal rights, right? Freedom of thought, freedom of speech, free inquiry, right? That these, right, and the protection of individual rights and minority rights, which is what our Bill of Rights is all about. The Bill of Rights was created and has been maintained for the purpose of protecting the minority against the tyranny of a majority. Because a democracy can, without the liberal protections of a liberal democracy, can totally run rampant over whichever majority it chooses without those built-in liberal protections in place. And that's the primary function of the Bill of Rights. And so we see that in all these supposedly communist societies, like supposedly North Korea is communist, but they use money, and it's not democratic. So it's not communist. Russia's not communist because they have always had money. And there's hardly anything communist about Putin. His dynamics and the way he runs his country is actually closer to fascism. They use money. It's a non-democratic society. If you don't have free and fair elections, it's not a democracy. And they haven't had free and fair elections in Russia for quite some time. And it was only for a brief period of time that they did have them in the 90s. And those even were questionable. But there's no free and fair elections in Russia now. There's no free and fair elections in North Korea. So that's not communist, and they have money. So what they call communist, what people lazily refer to as communist, is not. It is generally an authoritarian state whose dynamics, honestly, in many ways, are very similar to fascism. The only true difference, really, are the groups that they reward in communism versus fascism, right? In communism, there's a privileged class, right? I mean, that not in the theoretical sense. It's evenly divided in a theoretical sense. But what we've seen in the countries that claim to be communist is there's still a privileged class, right? It's just that privilege is decided by different criteria, right? It's decided by your ideology and which political group you're in, right? It's not determined by, well, are you part of the business community, right? Where it's like in fascism, they are, and in both. We've seen in both fascism and communism, they target minority groups that are perceived in some way to be in opposition to their immediate political goals, right? So Pol Pot targeted people wearing glasses, the educated, the professionals, lawyers, doctors, and made them all go work on the farms, starved them to death, and somewhere between 1 million, I think they think it's about 2 million. There's estimates, there's a lot of estimates. Some of the records are unclear, but somewhere between 1.5 and 3 million people were murdered by Pol Pot and his technically communist regime in the 70s in Cambodia. And that took place over a 4-year period when the Khmer Rouge was in charge of Cambodia. So that was a quarter of the population that was either murdered or starved to death because of all of the drastic changes. And I mean, they used Marx. I mean, they used Marx a lot, and all of these regimes did. They used the language, they used the ideology, they used the wording, they used all of that. But that did not match the reality on the ground. People were not treated evenly. People were not treated democratically. People did not have a vote or a say. The workers did not have autonomy, right? So a lot of the preconditions for communism just never existed. So they were never communist. So socialism, all right? What about all these socialist countries? Well, the truth about socialism is this as well. As Marx envisioned socialism, right? The creator of the concept of socialism and communism is that it is democratic, but they do use money. They can still use money. The idea being they're transitioning eventually to a moneyless society in communism, but socialism is a transitional state, and you're using money still, and there's redistribution, right? Things are decided democratically by the workers, right? He envisioned it as a democracy, and that it should be democratically decided by the majority, right? But that, again, there was the way Marx envisioned it, there's no protections, again, for the minority, right? So while socialism, actually, the original envisioning of socialism by Marx is a democratic society. So true socialism must be a democracy. But a danger of socialism is, like communism, is it does not necessarily have those liberal protections built into it. So again, the minority can be run over by the majority. You need those liberal protections. And a lot of societies in advanced countries that we would call democratic socialist countries, they do have a mix of, it's a capitalist society, but there's socialist interventions. That's the thing. All the countries that we think of as democratic socialist countries, they still use money. They use markets, but there's more government intervention into the economy in different ways. And each country has different ways of doing it, but they do have higher levels of taxation typically, and varying schemes of higher levels of government involvement in the economy in the interest of the worker and the people in the Commonwealth in general. Whereas in the United States, it's as much government intervention as we see. It's much smaller by comparison to, say, Europe or other advanced countries, right? And in some ways that's good. In some ways we see benefits from that. In a lot of ways we see the negative sides, right, of everyone not having health care. Whereas in a lot of these other countries, people have universal health care, that it's managed in such a way that they have a universal system. It may be single payer. Most of them actually aren't. It's a mix of public and private, and the government's involved, but they also have a private sector involved too. Unlike the NHS in England, that is a true single payer, where the government just runs everything. That's single payer. Single payer, and the other versions, they get to universal health care just in different ways. And these countries all have slightly different approaches to how they do it according to them. And we still haven't gotten there yet. We're still working on that. But we'll probably eventually talk more about that, about how we're going to get everyone else covered in the most affordable and effective way possible. But so anyway, that was just my main point, was that just because someone says they're communist or socialist doesn't make it true. If it's not democratic, they're not. Like, Cuba claimed to be communist, it's not. It claimed to be socialist, it's not. Because it's not democratic. There were never free and fair elections. It's not communist. They still use money. It's not communist. It's not socialist because you can't vote. You don't have free and fair elections. You sure as hell don't have liberal protections, right? But often what a lot of people think of as communist is actually fascism, just with slightly different packaging. And that we see that quite often is that the tactics and strategies are very similar. It's just one of the key differences is the different groups that are targeted for oppression, right? And the different groups that are rewarded for, supporting that oppression. So just wanted to make that quick, sort of, acknowledgement about that, that just because someone says there's something doesn't make it so. We'll probably talk a lot more about that, and as it relates to political ideologies regarding democracies, republics, more about socialism, and and just to say that anything that is, so if you're going to be socialist, you have to be democratic. That's a precondition for socialism, according to Marx. All right. So democratic socialism is really duplicative. All socialism is democratic. If it's not democratic, it's not really socialism. It's just another form of authoritarianism. That by nature, socialism could be oppressive, absolutely, if it doesn't have those liberal protections, but it must be democratic to truly be socialism, right? Not just what people call it, but to actually be how it was originally conceived by Marx, not a perverse, right? A lot of people came along in Russia and other places and completely perverted the vision. And there were a lot of problems with Marxism to begin with, theoretically, that just weren't going to work. But there were other ideas that are still valid, that can be incorporated, so that we can share more equitably and look out for each other while still rewarding the high performers, right? And the people who work harder or have more advanced skills, that are appropriate incentives, for people to be able to strive and, for peak performance while still being able to live an enjoyable, non-wage slave life, which is really what it's all about. You're not enslaved to a meaningless job your entire life that sucks the soul out of you. That there is some kind of, that the people work together, right? And the state is a mechanism for that. The people work together to make life more bearable for each other. And that's the core essence of socialism and communism, for that matter, right? But, so anyway, that's enough for the ideologies right now. I did briefly want to mentioned the UN sanctions, after the first Gulf War, killed a lot of people, did not, from the sanctions, a lot of people in Iraq after the first Gulf War, they didn't get any, medical, they didn't get enough medical, medicines, and they didn't get enough food. So a lot of people died of malnutrition and died of unnecessary diseases. Those numbers over the years have varied. Some numbers have put it between 1 and 1.5 million people died unnecessarily. The most accurate figures we currently have from 2020 put it at least 227,000 children between 91 and 98 died as a result of malnutrition and a lack of medicines from the sanctions. And also the fact that we destroyed their infrastructure pretty overwhelmingly really hobbled their economic recovery. So those knock-on effects from the first Gulf War in the 90s had disastrous consequences on the civilians over the following decade. So we know that hundreds of thousands, one way or another, did die as a result of those sanctions. So just illustrating the danger of having broad sanctions that end up harming the people. Like I said, dictators are often able to, hoard resources to, for themselves, and sanctions typically don't harm them. So you got to find sanctions that target the individual, or that target individuals close to him, that maximize the pressure on the dictator, and take away the key things that are of high value to the dictator, and that's going to vary from person to person. But it's got to be targeted. If it's going to hit the people, like I said, if you're denying people medicine or food, that just hurts the population. Dictators are going to get food. Dictators are going to get medicine. You're just hurting the people when you have those kinds of sanctions blocking, life-saving drugs and food that people need to eat to survive, right? That some things just shouldn't be, some things shouldn't be sanctioned, right? For humanitarian purposes. So I just wanted to point that out. That was always something to keep in mind when we start talking about sanctions and what we're going to do to try and get people, because you got to use pressure, diplomatic pressure. And probably one of the best ways is, right, having economic arrangements where you got businesses and stuff in their company, right, in their country, and you use those as carrots and sticks. We'll let this company do business here, but you've got to boost these human rights, or we're not sending these companies in, right? The problem is you got them and you want to pull them out, which you understand. That's kind of what you have to do sometimes. If once you're in and you're like, oh, they're being good, and then they start misbehaving, you're already in there. If you're going to pull out, then you're hurting the worker, right? So that can be a challenge. So you do have to look very carefully at the specifics of what you're going to do to sanction somebody, so that it's not having negative knockoff effects on people. And that can be very challenging, right? But you don't want to go to war either, because then how many people do you kill that way? But it's trying to find what is the most peaceful, non-destructive solution that's going to bring somebody around, right, to not abusing their folks. And that's always a challenge, and we got a long way to go with that. But anyway, we're going to get into Biden now. We got a lot to cover there. A couple of things people aren't happy about, especially progressives, with the Department of Justice, two specific instances. One where the Department of Justice agreed to represent Donald Trump in the defamation case brought against him by E. Jean Carroll, the writer who alleged he raped her. And he said she's crazy or something like that. Something that she claims is defamatory. So that case is going through, but, I mean, it is defamatory. That case is going through, but it was thought, well, Trump's going to represent, Trump may just end up having to represent himself since he's no longer president. But because, according to the Biden administration, because he made that negative comment disparaging comment about E. Jean Carroll during an interview, during a question while he was at a functioning as United States president, the United States must defend him because he made that comment while he was working as president. Personally, I would like to see Trump pay for his own legal fees for this trial. But I understand the reasoning and the precedent. If Biden were to allow this, that could open up the possibility that presidents moving forward are subject to all kinds of lawsuits, right? For all kinds of things. And that could be good, right? For accountability, but it could also open up the potential for a lot of frivolous lawsuits by any organization that wants to bring it, just to punish a president who left office that they didn't like. So, and I mean, I can easily see that happening. So if we could build in institutional protections to keep that from happening, that would be great, because I would like to see, leaders being held to account for their actions, right? And them having to foot the bill for them. But, it's like if I'm operating in a function as president, it's like an incentive. It's like, who's going to take the job if they know as soon as they leave office, they're going to be faced with like 20 lawsuits, right? That the government is not going to help back them up on, right? That they're going to be on their own and they'll be wiped out. So who would want to be president? So that's kind of the idea behind the government representing Trump, even though I'm sure Biden and everyone else would love to see Trump pay for it, and I would too. But that's the reason why the government, the DOJ, is gonna represent Trump in the case. Don't like it, I understand. Similar deal with the case regarding redactions from internal deliberations of the Department of Justice regarding whether Trump committed obstruction of justice regarding the Mueller investigation. The judge, Amy Berman Jackson, had ordered the document to be released, and they released it about those deliberations, but there were certain redactions. Berman Jackson was not happy about those redactions, nor were liberals or progressives. We want transparency. We want to know what they were saying. And we're right to want that. However, the Biden administration and Department of Justice under Merrick Garland said, nope, we're not, we've got some redactions in here. We're keeping them in, right? We've given you all the text from the deliberations we can. These redactions are vital to protect internal deliberations, of, key players, within, the Department of Justice, and their anonymity should be protected. Now, a lot of people say, well, why? This is like an investigation of the President Trump, interfering with the Mueller investigation. Well, one of the reasons that may be true, we don't know because I haven't seen the redactions. Only people on the inside know what they are, deep inside, is that regarding the DOJ at the time was Trump friendly. That was a Trump DOJ. So their deliberations may have very well contained some very tortured reasoning, and that's being polite about it, trying to justify that a president cannot be charged after leaving office. So, from a logical standpoint and from really a legal standpoint, there's no precedent for that, and it's bogus logically that anyone would be held to be above the law. That's just unacceptable. That means that a president is essentially a ruler above the law, and that's an unacceptable premise. That is not an acceptable punishment to any civilized society, certainly not to a democracy, right, with checks and balances, certainly not a democracy as envisioned by the founders. They did not envision a democracy with a president who was beyond the law. So that whole idea is utter nonsense, and most right-thinking adults, I will say virtually all of them, know it's nonsense. There is no there's no precedent for it. There's no solid reasoning for not being able to prosecute a president for committing crimes while he was in office. I can see how it'd be convenient, and I can see how there'd be certain protections to try and limit that, such as representing him in a trial, right? But Biden's not stopping the trial. He's not stopping investigations. He's just saying we're going to represent you. But regarding the redaction thing, they don't want to release those comments, possibly because it may set a precedent. As bogus as it is, it's going to put the words out there of the possibility that Trump can't be, the DOJ internally decided already that Trump is above the law, right? And even though that's bogus, and most Americans would be, that's nonsense, that's a precedent not set in law, but set by policy, internal policy discussions. That's all it is. But that's enough to set the tone. That's enough to give ammunition to the right and to the far right. It's a gift. So that may be a good reason why they're not revealing the redactions. Or the deliberations could have said he's guilty as hell, right? And if that's what the deliberations are, right, that they're guilty, then everybody's like, well, why the hell aren't you charging him? Why is he in cuffs already? And Biden may want to proceed in a certain strategic fashion to get all his ducks lined in a row before he makes a move on certain people. Department of Justice has got over 500 people, right, that they're charged with crimes for January 6th. They're investigating tons of other people, so they got their hands full with a lot of stuff. So this is why he's making these decisions. So I'm not crazy. I want to see the redactions too. I'm not crazy about it. I want transparency, but I believe that there's some, they're keeping their cards close to their chest. And even though it's not, my preference, Biden has no reason to carry water for Trump other than to protect the office of the presidency and to protect the legitimacy of the Department of Justice. And those really where his interests lie. It's not to protect Trump. So whatever he's doing is to protect the legitimacy of DOJ and to protect the office of the president in a long-term sense, right? He's not just making decisions for immediate political gain, which could have, horrible, drastic negative effects down the line. So I think these are wise decisions, not decisions I necessarily like, and not even necessarily that I agree with, right? I'm not privy to all the internal deliberations. If I were, I may disagree with them horribly. But I can understand their reasoning from this perspective. So I'm disappointed, I'm not angry about it. So that's that. I did want to say we're very happy about the fact that the Biden administration is reviewing all the immigrants, all the veterans, that were non-American citizens that had served in the military but had been kicked out of the country during the Trump administration, right? That even though they'd served, they'd been kicked out. And some had committed crimes and offenses or made some kind of mistake and got the boot. But and certainly the serious violent criminals should not be readmitted. Some of these people didn't commit any crime. But they're reviewing all these veterans that served in the military but then were deported. And they're going to bring them back to the country. And we're very pleased about that. That's the right thing to do. That's a noble thing to do. It's unconscionable that a lot of these folks were kicked out in the first place after serving in the military for our country. That's just crazy. I can see with violent criminals, I definitely see why you would give them a boot, but not necessarily a lot of other people who committed no crimes or very minor offenses. So I think that's really good that they're reviewing that and they'll make decisions on getting people back into the country that were unfairly kicked out. Also, very happy that the Biden administration immediately stopped separating families at the border. Right? That was something that the Trump administration had done aggressively as a deterrent, trying to keep people from coming to this country. The problem is that's a crime against humanity that no human should ever condone or support or tolerate. It's a despicable act of oppression, and it's one of the most disgusting acts I've ever seen. And it's hard to believe that I've seen as many Americans trying to defend it. It's really upsetting. So I'm not going to get hung up on that, but I don't tolerate that nonsense from people when I hear that. So anyway, we're very happy that they're not separating families. Conditions at the border are still bad, and they're going to be bad for a while. They got a lot of work to do on that, right? DHS has got to ramp up big time, the more shelters, better facilities, right, to accommodate an influx. They're expecting a lot more migrants to come, not, partially because the Biden administration, but also just seasonal migration. And we see this all the time, that there is a seasonal fluctuation of migrants coming to the country, and that there are a lot of terrible conditions in these Central American countries, that really force people to run. And if you kick them back, they'll just try and leave again because they're just so bad. There's so much poverty and so much crime, or oppression or lack of opportunity, that they have no other choice but to try and get out again. And so they just keep trying over and over again. So obviously the Biden administration has a lot of work to do in, better and more facilities at the border to be able to deal with the increased influx of immigrants and refugees, and also, that addressing the root causes. And Kamala Harris has talked about that, and she's already visited countries in Central America talking about wanting to work on addressing these root causes. And so we really need to help bring economic opportunity to these countries in Central America and help shore up their governance and their institutions of government and of governance, to fight corruption and to prevent corruption in their societies, so that, the prosperity is shared with the population, and it's not just going to the people at the top and everybody else is just poor as hell. So there's a lot we can do there. It will take a long time to address the root causes. You're talking decades at least, but you have to think the United States has contributed to a lot of the plights of Central American countries over centuries, right? Our dominance of the Western Hemisphere, and a number of our engagements in Central America over the years, both overt and covert, in sometimes fighting wars to, of one form or another, not technically wars, but interventions to protect American businesses, and also very a lot of intense economic strangulation on these smaller countries that have very little bargaining power against us. So I think we've definitely squeezed them a little harder than we should have in the past, without a doubt. And just as far as the Cold War, I mean, we backed a lot of dictators in a lot of South and Central American countries that were horribly oppressive, and they're still recovering from the effects of a lot of those horrible dictators and what they did to their countries, economies and populations, with mass murders across many of these countries. So we'll go into a lot more detail about that. It's a huge generalization that's going to vary country by country what those specific details were. But the U.S. has thrown its muscle around a lot for its 200 plus years, and we have some responsibility. Certainly, the bulk of their responsibility falls to people who run the country and live in the country. But there's a lot we can do to help them, and make things better. And we can't do everything. There's a lot we can't do, but we do have a moral obligation to try and help the best way we can. And so when we do, let's be smart about it and make the right investments that are going to give them long-term return, and stability, and not just set this thing up so that American corporations can come in and make a ton of money for themselves, and the people of the country get a pittance, right? And the people at the top, they get a good cut, but everyone else at the bottom, they're just they get a job, it's okay, maybe helps them survive a little bit, but it's not what they should be getting, right? We need to spread the prosperity and the wealth a little bit more. There's just a lot of corruption in these countries. And so there's a lot we can do to help them with that, and sort of predicate a lot of this reform, a lot of this funding and assistance or contracts for, factories to come down there, whatever that's predicated on democratic reform, right? And liberal democratic reform and the protections of the minorities, right? And protections of workers' rights, right? Things like that those things, that is contingent upon you getting a contract, is that you have to fulfill these other obligations first. So we want to see more of that, right? That's going to take a long time, but that's credit to him for not separating families. We're very, very happy about that, and for trying to bring back as many immigrant vets as he can that were kicked out. But we need, there's a lot of stuff we got to work on there still. But it's only been 6 months, right? So, yes, we want to talk about the executive order. He just this past week, Biden penned an executive order targeting anti-competitive practices within the economy. So basically, what he did was he directed at least 12 agencies, I think it's more than that, in the federal government, to institute new practices to improve competition within the economy and crack down on anti-competitive practices by a number of businesses in different industries. So cracking down, one thing is he's instructed the Federal Trade Commission to crack down on non-compete agreements. There's somewhere between 30 to 60 million people in the United States are affected by non-compete agreements. That's when a company has you agree. So they can vary what the details are, right? But they can sometimes have you agree to not take another job with a competitor as a condition for taking this job. So it can make it hard for you to get another job in the same industry. They can very often in non-competes, they restrict you from divulging to anyone else your salary. So if you abide by that, it makes it very difficult. And if you don't, you technically can, be sued for that by the company or fired. But the problem with that is if you can't talk about your wage, you don't know what other people are making. It's a secret, right? And that makes it harder for you to know what other people are making, to have some sense of where you are in the market and what your relative value is to the company in reference to these other individuals. So it can make it hard for you to bargain, right? Also making it hard to bargain is the fact that they know you're going to have a hard time getting another job in another company in the industry because you signed the non-compete. So you have less bargaining power because there's less chance of you going somewhere else to work for a competitor because you signed that non-compete. So they're going to crack down on that. That's a really good thing. We want to see more of that. They're also going, where is this thing? There's a number of things that we like that we saw in here. That he's directing the FDA, Biden's directing the FDA to work with states to import drugs from Canada. That's going to save people and hospitals and other medical companies. It's going to save them a lot of money, especially consumers, by importing drugs from Canada. So that's awesome. That is a very pro-consumer move. He also directs the Federal Trade Commission to evaluate hospital mergers, scrutinize mergers in general, especially hospitals and big tech, right? Especially big tech mergers where there are acquisitions of mergers of large platforms or acquisitions by large platforms of new beginners, right? Where they just gulp up the competition right away. So there's never really any true competition. As soon as some new competition comes on the field, they just buy them out, right? So there's only one real big boy around dominating the whole marketplace. So we're liking that Biden's gonna, keep big business in check a little bit here. He's instructed the FTC to develop rules and data on rules on data and surveillance acquisition, which will be really, I think is crucial to make sure that big tech isn't unduly taking or selling your information in an unethical way, isn't selling it or using it in an unethical way, that is being responsible, right? And so this is a good step in that direction, right? This is an executive order, and this is just the beginning, right? Because basically all these agencies now have to develop policy, and they have to do some analysis first, and they have to look at things. They're not going to be able to crank this out like overnight, right? But they're going to do an analysis, and then they'll determine what will be their agency position, and how will be their approach consistent with the goals of the Biden administration. Also wants to restore net neutrality. We're all for that. We're very unhappy when net neutrality rules were removed. So we're really glad to see that that Biden wants to restore them. We think that's great for the consumer. Also, he's instructed the USDA to crack down on abuses by meat processors. So this could have the effect of not only protecting workers that work there, but also help improve competition by evening the playing field between these large meat processors and smaller operations and other farmers as well who have to deal with these businesses. So those are some things we really like. In addition to that, he has also, since the beginning of the year now, the Biden administration has forgiven $3 billion worth of student loans to people who in one way were defrauded by some kind of irreputable, institution of higher learning, supposed institution of higher learning. For example, the most recent, I think it was just 1.5 billion. He previously in the year he'd forgiven more, and I think the last installment was like 1.5. So total is 3 billion forgiven now. So yeah, it's learning institutions like ITT, Technical Institute, and Corinthian colleges who basically did a shoddy job teaching people and charging them exorbitant rates, and then people weren't able to get jobs with the worthless degrees that they had paid a lot of money for. And they were it had been determined that they had grossly misled these students into thinking they would be able to get work. And then they weren't provided with the level of education they needed, and that the amount that they were charged was just exorbitant, far beyond what was appropriate for the level of, certainly for the education they received, and the fact that they could not then not get a job after receiving a degree in the field with which they were supposed to be able to get a job. So yeah, $3 billion forgiven. We're loving that. I know there's discussions about forgiving more student loan debt. I believe a lot of Democrats want to see 50,000 per student loan holder forgiven. But I believe right now Biden just wants to see 10. He thinks that might be a bit much. That would be nice, right? We'd all like to have money. I still got student loans. That'd be great. It would help me out if I got some student loans forgiven. So it's a question of what's fair. You don't want to decimate the loan industry. But they have made hand over fist, over the recent years. But you don't want to, so a readjustment is definitely in order for certain, and a correction. But the question is how much do you want to punish an industry before it becomes punitive? And I don't have an answer to that question. That's a good question. But that's probably defining the problem between Biden's 10,000 and the other Democrats like Schumer want 50 forgiven. So, you want to hold businesses accountable. You don't want to destroy them because you still need them, right? And you want to make them do what's right, but at the same time, you still need to be solvent. Not all of them necessarily. The worst actors you got to put out of business. But you can't do that to everybody. You've got to, there are a lot of institutions, banks that, need to get paid, and they should get paid. They've loaned out money. They've done you a service, and they should get paid for that, right? The people who loaned me money to get my degrees, they hooked me up, and I got to pay interest on them, right? But I never could have gotten those degrees without it. I never could have, right? So I have to thank them for trusting me, right? That they said I was a risk they were willing to take, right? That I had collateral, that my credit was good enough or whatever, that they were willing to say, okay, we're going to loan you this money. You got to pay it back. And honestly, the interest is really low right? You can have the subsidized and unsubsidized student loans, but overall pretty reasonable. The problem is that the tuition's so damn high, right? That's the problem, is that tuition in recent years has just gotten so high that it prices a lot of people out of college. And if you're able to get a loan, right, that you're an indentured servant for the next 20 years, right? Which means that, that locks you in, right? If you're locked into paying student loans for 10 to 20 years, there's a lot of stuff you can't do. There are a lot of options that are not open to you, right? You're weighed down by that debt. There's a lot of other things or jobs or, whatever ventures you might try that you can't because you're saddled by that debt. And the debt's gotten so out of control in the last generation that it's become burdensome. So certainly people who've been defrauded should absolutely be, refunded that money. And so we applaud that. We're glad about that. We wouldn't mind seeing another round of debt forgiveness. Certainly, I have my own personal bias that I want that to happen. That would be good for me. But also, in truth, I can handle paying it back. It's not crushing me, but it is crushing some people, and they're the ones who really need the relief, right? So I'm definitely, for those who truly need it, I'm all for debt forgiveness, but not necessarily for everyone. I think that if people can afford to pay it back, they should, right? Unless you've been defrauded, you made an agreement to pay for college, right? And, it's like, I can see the argument for some debt forgiveness just because what choice have consumers had, right? We've kind of had our backs to the wall. So I gotta go to this college, and you could save money going to a state school, right? But it's still way more expensive than it used to be. It's a lot more expensive to go to state school than it was a generation ago, right? So yeah, debt has just become a common theme, and this is a great way to free a lot of people from it. So again, we applaud the Biden administration for that. Moving on, right? Not trying to get hung up for too long. The Hunter Biden art sale, right? Not happy about that. Obviously Hunter Biden's selling some artwork. He's become an artist now, new promising budding artist apparently. But apparently the prices could go pretty high, hundreds of thousands of dollars, which is an exorbitant amount for someone who just became an artist like in the last, couple of years. No matter how talented he is, right? With very little art experience. It looks bad, right? I mean, Hunter has a right to do what he wants, choose a new career, express himself and make a living on it. I get it. He has a right to do that. The problem is that it could really screw up the business of the people. It opens up the possibility for the appearance of corruption or corruption. The way they have it set up right now is that the buyers are going to be secret. The idea of being, well, Hunter's never going to know, right? And Joe Biden's never going to know who bought it. So there's no way anybody can curry favor. But the idea that secret will be kept is hard to believe. It's too easy for a multitude of different ways for word to get out that so-and-so paid so much for your page, right? Technically, it's a secret, but word can get out. It's not a problem. And yeah, that'll definitely happen. Believe it. They have people from government agencies giving up secrets all the time. They're not going to be able to keep a secret. People aren't going to keep a secret about who gave money to, who bought Hunter Biden's paintings. If that were the case, whoever buys Hunter's paintings, there's the potential that, right, Hunter, is benefiting from this, and Joe can, look favorably upon whoever makes these purchases. So we think, and this is based off a bunch of stuff we've read from a bunch of other people's opinions, a lot of different opinions about it. Our opinion, based on that, is that transparency is better than secrecy in this instance, right? Sometimes it's not. Sometimes you need a little secrecy to protect government stuff, top secret stuff, national security, blah, blah, blah. But most of the time, transparency is the way to go. Most of the time. And I mean most of the time. 90+%. Right? And this is one of those times where just buy the paintings. Two things. One, buy the painting, but set the painting prices at a reasonable level. No more than whatever would be considered reasonable for the first showing of a talented artist. Let's make the generous assumption that Hunter Biden is, actually talented artist, because he may be. I have no idea. But let's make that assumption that perhaps he is. What is generally, what is typically the price range for someone just starting out? Let's set it at that. That way the prices aren't exorbitant, so it doesn't look like he's being totally bought out. Right? He's still doing him a favor, right? And so there could still be that, it was only $5,000. It wasn't, $100,000 or $500,000, but it's still like, dude's giving me a bump, Dad. Remember him next time, will you? So that's why we say limit the amount, right? Because they can be currying favor at any amount, whether it's 5,000 or 100,000. But at least it's not a full buyout where it's like, somebody just bought Hunter a yacht, right? That it's a limited amount that's reasonable, right? So that it doesn't, you're avoiding not only corruption, but the appearance of corruption. So one, it's a reasonable amount of money, appropriate for someone of that experience and skill level, one. And two, it's transparent. It means all buyers are disclosed. That way, if somebody is currying favor or gets preferential treatment, we'll know who they are, right? We'll know who hooked up Hunter, who was looking out for Hunter, and who got rewarded for it, and we'll know. And then we can hold Biden to account for it if he does. Transparency. That's the better way. That's what we'd like to see them do. That's not what the current path is. We don't like. It's a gift to the right wing. It's an unnecessary, unforced error. It's a gift to the right to do it this way. It's creating an unnecessary scandal like Burisma, which is a fake scandal, right? There was no corruption uncovered, but it looks sleazy when you got Hunter trying to use his name, right? And that's the thing. Biden is president, and when Hunter was dealing with Burisma, right, he was using Biden's name as vice president. So, there's a big sphere of influence for the vice president or the president, right? It's kind of hard to go anywhere where that influence is not felt. So it's important that we limit the appearance as much as we can of the potential for conflict of interest, the potential for corruption. That's part of the problem with the Hillary Clinton when she ran the State Department, when she was still too close to many of her donors for the Clinton Global Initiative and for the Clinton Foundation, right? She needed to keep those people at a distance, just like Bill Clinton didn't need to have the head of DOJ. He didn't need to stop and talk to her on the plane, right? They didn't have to stop her plane and they have to have a conversation, right? While, Hillary is being investigated, right? And there's no indication that anything untoward happened, but it created the appearance that something might have. It was unsound. It was a mistake that Clinton shouldn't have made. And I'm forgetting her last name right now, Loretta, what's her name, who was head of DOJ at the time, should not have agreed to meet with Clinton on the plane when they just briefly, casually met to talk, because that was a gift to the right wing, to Fox News. Oh, look, they're talking on a plane in private while Hillary's being investigated. It creates the appearance of the potential for, that Bill Clinton should not have spoken to the head of DOJ while the investigation of Hillary Clinton was ongoing. He shouldn't have done it. That was a careless mistake. So it's things like that we have to avoid. Sometimes we make careless mistakes because we're busy. Sometimes we make careless mistakes because we're too cocky. But that's just an unnecessary forced error by the Biden administration. So I hope that they take steps to make it more transparent and limit the amount that Hunter is actually paid on this thing. Want him to make a living as an artist, want him to do well, but don't want it to hurt the people's business either, because this could blow up. It's just something that the right wing can use against Joe Biden unnecessarily and against the Democrats. It's unnecessary. It doesn't even need to happen. So hopefully they'll kill that, or at least, change it. Anyway, moving on again. We've talked about Hunter Biden. Oh yeah, real quickly. So, I was upset about, we said Saudi Arabia, we're not happy with how Biden's handled it. He's placed sanctions on them, on individuals involved with the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, journalist living in the United States who was murdered by Iranian assassins. But MBS, the guy that Mohammed bin Salman, who basically is de facto ruler at this point of Saudi Arabia, that his brother Khalid just visited the White House this week. And Khalid was implicated by the CIA in the investigation of Khashoggi's murder. And supposedly, according to the CIA, he was involved with the planning of Khashoggi's, not necessarily murder, but capture. And Khalid has even stated that he was involved, but he thought he was just being brought back, right? Not that he was going to be murdered. Now, we have no idea if that's true or not, but he was involved in the abduction of Khashoggi. And seeing him, basically operate in MBS's capacity as the leader of, in his place at the White House is pretty hard to take. Pretty hard to see someone who's essentially an accomplice to the murder of Khashoggi in the White House. And they played that, they tried not to publicize that. They played that down, gave, as much as they could. Biden's really trying to thread the needle on this because we need Saudi Arabia for a lot of things, right? But we also need to hold MBS and the other people who killed Khashoggi, who were sentenced, but then are getting, really cushy treatment while they serve out their sentence, right? Living lives of luxury and lots of amenities and far more freedom than they should have, and their sentences reduced as well. People sentenced to death who then have their sentences reduced to 20 years. So there's a lot of justice that has not been done in the name of Khashoggi. Ultimately, what we would like to see is this brought before an international court, right? And that it be tried out in the open, because at this point we're relying on the CIA to tell us what happened. And I generally want to believe the CIA, but as we know from plenty of experience in the past, you can never be totally sure, right? Because they're never telling you everything. They can't, right? And sometimes they lie on purpose. Sometimes they have to, right? They need to. Sometimes they do. And then sometimes they just do it to cover their ass, right? And they don't need to. They just do it because it's, easier. That's why we need good inspectors general, robust inspectors general to investigate all these agencies, right? Because we do need intelligence agencies, but they do need to be monitored. They cannot police themselves. They have to be kept in check. So that's what you have. You have these inspectors general in each of these federal agencies, and they're not popular with the agencies either. People at FDA don't like FDA's inspector general, and people at CIA don't like theirs. Nobody likes being kept an eye on, right? Cops don't like internal affairs. Nobody likes to be policed and to be watched, but we all need it. No one, that's why we have laws, because people can't behave themselves. We have to have certain laws or guardrails or restrictions, right, to guide us and keep us in place. And if we screw up, we get dinged a little bit. It's kind of like it's conditioning. Certainly it's conditioning. And our certainly our penal system is far more punitive than it should be. I don't want to go off on a rant here, but we should try and look at models, particularly in some other European countries and other countries as well, that is less punitive and more reformative, right? Where there's, they're reforming the person's rehabilitation, rehabilitating the person's behavior, the person's way of thinking, learning new skills, right? Learning new coping strategies, right? And really focusing on that, and less, you still have to punish them, right? But that there's less focus on the punishment and harshness of it, which they still have to suffer, but that you do a much better job of rehabilitating them and focusing on developing those concrete skills that they're going to need to, rejoin society and be a productive and law-abiding member. So we do need to head in that direction. So definitely wanted to make a comment on that. But yeah, hopefully in the fullness of time, we would like to see MBS and the others involved in the murder of Khashoggi brought to trial transparently, where evidence is presented, right, in a criminal court for everyone to see. We'll see. We'll see if that happens. we'll see. But that ultimately is be like to see where we want to see MBS and the co-conspirators held accountable. So the other thing was say this is a big deal. This is a really big deal. I can't believe I didn't mention it in the last episode. And this is a big deal. I want to stress it. In the American Rescue Plan, one of the things that's such a major accomplishment and a big deal was that in the healthcare system, on the Obamacare, right, on the exchanges within Obamacare, that the law that was passed through the American Rescue Plan, that people's premiums are now limited on the exchange to no more than 8.5%, right, of their income, right? So there's a cap. You're not going to pay any more than 8.5% for your health insurance premiums. That didn't exist before. Boom, that's in there now, right? For the next 2 years, or for 2021 and 2022, right? And they've also, before the subsidies on the exchanges just went from like 100% to 400% of the poverty level in various gradations based on your income, right? Greater subsidies for people making less for people making more, right? But they removed that cap for the next 2 years so that anyone who wants to get on the exchange, even if you're above that 400% of the poverty level, you can get some subsidies to help you to pay for your health insurance. And those boosted subsidies are going to help make those premiums more affordable. So it helps out the insurance companies with the additional subsidies. It helps out the consumer by, limiting how much you're going to have to pay for those premiums, right? And the overall cost. And then it helps out the whole country as a whole, because that whole thing is geared towards expanding access for the remaining people that are not covered, that do not have healthcare coverage. And I know those numbers vary anywhere between 15 million and 30 million. They fluctuate depending on which sources and the times of the year. But, tens of millions of people don't have healthcare coverage. And so this is geared towards getting more of them on the rolls, healthcare rolls, and getting more people healthcare, right? They have coverage, so then they can go to the doctor, and get the medical procedures they need without losing an arm and a leg, or just going to the emergency room and having, the government foot the bill in the end, and then the people foot the bill for it in the end. Or just people go to the emergency room and they're charged an arm and a leg. They pay what they can, but they end up defaulting on a lot of it because they just can't pay it. And then, it's like, well, the people eat that. So this is really a big deal. This is a major fix to Obamacare. It's temporary right now, 2021 and 2022. I know Biden wants to make it permanent, and I hope he does. I think this is a really big win for consumers here, and a great way to keep healthcare insurance premiums down. While bringing in more business for the insurance companies, right? And we'll see if this works. So far, it has, and we've seen more and more people getting on the exchanges, and that it's increased in popularity over the years. So even though there's still a lot of imperfections to Obamacare, it's increased in popularity because it has given a lot of people, tens of millions of people, access to healthcare they didn't have before, and that it is making it more affordable. There have been problems and gaps that need to be patched, and there still are. It's not perfect, right? But it's a far cry from what it was before. And the Republican solution is they don't even have one. They're just like, well, let the companies do what they will, and you deal with it. That's basically a Republican solution, which is, anyone who's really thinking about it goes, well, that's not acceptable, right? That, most people agree in the United States agree that, there should be some basic level, there's strong majority support for at least a basic level of coverage, right? How we get there, that's debated. But there's pretty strong support for some type of universal healthcare system, not necessarily single payer and not necessarily Medicare for all, less support for those, but a universal approach that does end up insuring all of the population, or virtually all. Some of these universal systems in other countries don't get 100%. They're like 99 or 98 or 99.5. There's there's some folks that aren't insured. Sometimes they don't insure immigrants, right? People visiting, things like that. So there is that. But near universal. That's the goal. But there's lots of different ways to get there. And we will talk more about that down the road. So that's a huge deal. And here's the thing. Democrats suck at explaining the big good things that we've done, right? Because sometimes they're technical. And like this thing, 8.5%, right? It's got numbers in it. So most people's eyes glaze over right away. But it's like, that's limiting. Like before they could charge you a hell of a lot more than that. And there's nothing you could do about it. But now there's a law that says, no, you can't. No, you can't. This is the limit, right? But they've smoothed it out with the insurance companies because they boost the subsidies for people, right? So that they'll be able, to afford, to pay for their health care, and insurance companies are going to get paid, and they're going to get more customers. So they can go along, right? There's a payoff for them to go along with this reduced premium. Yeah. So also, here's the big one. Okay, here we are. We're here. All right. I'm on track tonight. Notes help. Organized notes. I had a ton of notes last time, but they were woefully organized, and it was pitiful. But anyway, Afghanistan. This is the monster. All right. This was the target for the night that I saved for last, or almost last. Is that we're pulling out of Afghanistan very quickly. This is Biden's decision. We're going to be out way sooner than we thought. The initial, I think, plans were to be out by September 11th, and we'll be out before then. 90% of the forces are gone. In the end, it's just going to be 600 or so military there to protect the U.S. Embassy. And that's going to be it as far as the military presence. Right now, there's the Afghan government's got a military, but Afghan government's pretty shaky. Might not be able to hold up against the Taliban for very long. It's unclear. They're corrupt. They got governance issues. They're embattled. They're disorganized. They think they've come a long way, but have they come far enough to stand against the Taliban? I don't know. Taliban's making a lot of gains and they're coming on strong. There's a lot of them. They're very determined. And we're pulling out. We've been there for 20 years. According to the Cost of War Project, which is a program from the Watson Institute of International and Public Affairs at Brown University. And a lot of these, I'm going to be quoting some stats for you here regarding Afghanistan, as well as the wars in Iraq and the Middle East and Asia, will be from Brown University and their institute, the Watson Institute, and their Cost of War program, which looks at not only, how many, soldiers are killed and wounded and how many civilians are killed and wounded, but also what are the true costs of the war. And that's not just what we're paying out for it right away, for the actual war itself, but also down the line, they're calculating what are, veterans benefits going to be, what are disability payments going to be, what are the interest payments going to be on these, because the taxpayers never, they didn't pass a law, to fund this. This was put on the credit card. This is deficit financed, war fighting. All these wars were put on the credit card, right? So we're basically borrowing money from China and Japan. Those are the two major holders of U.S. debt. Japan number one, China's number two. UK is a distant third. Ireland's a distant fourth. Yeah. Didn't know that, did you? Yeah. So, by far and away, Japan and China are the biggest holders of U.S. debt. They're basically the ones who are financing all of our profligate spending, whether that be unwise wars on the other side of the world or other dumb spending like tax giveaways to rich people who don't need it, right? We basically borrowed money from the Chinese and Japanese and the others, right? The Brits and the Irish to pay for all this stuff, right? Instead of just paying for it outright, right? We borrowed to do all that stuff, right? So here's the question. Should we have been in Afghanistan? Well, we had to go get bin Laden, right? We were duty bound. We had to go get him. We could not let him get away with what he did, right? So we had to go after him. And the way through that, certainly things could have been prosecuted better. We had to go get him. I think the problem was we took our eye off the ball. Well, say George W. Bush did, and decided to go in, after we invaded Afghanistan, he got distracted by Iraq. We had no business ever going into Iraq. That whole thing was a waste of time. We should have gone after after bin Laden, either through Afghanistan or Pakistan. But we should not have stayed. We stayed too long. And I know why we stayed. We stayed for intelligence gathering purposes, right? And to fight the war on terror. And that's understandable up to a point. It certainly is, right? Because you've got all these terrorists that were in Afghanistan and on the other side of the border in Pakistan, right? That want to destroy the United States and that were involved with Al Qaeda in one aspect or another. And I think it was successful in that we destroyed a lot of Al Qaeda, not all of it, but we definitely degraded Al Qaeda severely. And we obviously did end up getting bin Laden. Obama and the SEALs under Obama finally got bin Laden. They got him in Pakistan. He was in Abbottabad, Pakistan when they got him. And that is not across the border, right? That's pretty deeply in the heart of Pakistan, in the northern part of Pakistan. So, we've been active. We've been active in Afghanistan. We've been active in Pakistan, active in Iraq. We had military involvement in Libya and ending the regime of Gaddafi. We've been involved military to some degree, a limited degree, as far as support, and some very, very limited fighting by special forces in Syria. But Cost of War project looked at all of those. All right, so in Afghanistan right now, they've calculated when it's all said and done, we'll have spent $2.24 trillion just in Afghanistan, and that's including interest payments, disability payments, veterans benefits, right? Plus the actual cost of fighting the war. That's all costs included. $2.24 trillion for Afghanistan, about $2 trillion for Iraq, okay, and then roughly about $2 trillion for the Iraq invasion, the war from the Iraq invasion in 2003. It kind of cost us about $2 trillion as well. And so when you include all those different wars or conflicts, military excursions, whatever you want to call them, right? Because we didn't actually declare war. Right, so officially it's not a war, but that becomes arbitrary at a certain point, right? Only Congress can declare war, but when you're fighting and blowing people up, you're at war with them, right? Maybe not officially, but in actuality, that's what you're doing. You're at war with people. When you're killing them, you're at war with them. When you're fighting another country, when you're fighting another military, you are in fact at war with them, regardless of what. Again, we're denouncing labels here, dishonest labels, right? And we're going to be returning to that probably many times over the course of this series. Is just because someone tells you something and says they're this doesn't make it so. Just because somebody flies the communist label or flies the democratic label or the socialist label or the libertarian label doesn't make it so. It is their actions. It is how they implement policies. It is whether they're democratic. It is whether they have liberal institutions, right? There's certain criteria they must meet to fulfill this. You can't just say you're something and then it's true. Just because you say you're communist or democratic doesn't make it true. Just because you're for the people, right? Like Republicans they're very good at using a lot of words and terminology of the working classes and of, people in jobs that require less education, right? So they're used to speaking their language more often because that's the constituency they target. And like very clever salesmen, they're very good at speaking that language and understanding that audience. Sadly, that's something that Democrats really suck at. We're really good at coming up with good policy ideas. What we suck at is communicating them to regular people who don't formulate policy ideas and don't know anything about how you do that. So that's a monstrous thing. This is one of those things that could really slay the dragon. If Democrats employ the right people, and this is what we got to do across the board, anytime we're going to gain support at the state level, local level, national level, whatever. When you're on TV, in media, meeting anybody, we need people that can shoot straight, not hem and haw, right? Talk with regular folk without talking down to them or seem like you're talking down to them. Sometimes just using big words, right? Working people who don't understand those big words can feel like some working people. And there's some working folks who don't have college degrees that have great vocabularies, better than mine, right? So it depends, always depends on the individual. But, right, with a lot of folks necessarily, maybe they're not dumb, but they're not sophisticated politically, right? And they don't have like this, elaborate vocabulary. And they're not around people who do. So there's no real need for them to develop that. If they were in a different environment, they probably would, right? But people rise to the occasion that is available to them in their environment. So anyway, you got to talk to the audience at their level, right? And explain things clearly, right? Like before you're going to pay this much for your healthcare premiums. Now, because of Biden, you're going to be stopped at this level. That's a really important thing to point out to people. And these other things like the cracking down on anti-competitive practices, how this is going to help you. And I said they're cracking down on the non-compete agreements, but Biden's also directing the FTC to crack down on unfair, unjustifiable, arbitrary licensing agreements that exist in a lot of industries in this country where you've already gotten the education from college, you're really qualified for the job, but there's this arbitrary licensing requirement, and those licenses can vary from state to state. So it can make it very hard if you're, say, like an engineer or another type of profession that requires licensing to take a job and go to another state, because the licensing requirements are different. So they're going to be looking at how to make those licensing agreements more legitimate, eliminate the ones that are arbitrary, right? Or how to make them more fair and equitable. So we really like that. Again, we're very concerned about Afghanistan, right? We ideally, our perception at this point is that we should have gotten in and got it out. We should have not diverted any of our attention from Iraq. It should have all been laser focused on Afghanistan and getting bin Laden, and we should have gotten in and gotten out as quickly as we could, right? And minimize civilian casualties as much as possible. They're going to happen because they happen in every war, and you do your damnedest to avoid them, right? And had we gotten in quicker and been more focused, we might have been able to get bin Laden earlier, but we didn't, and it became protracted. And because we divided our resources between focusing on Afghanistan and Iraq, we really took our eye off the ball. And so we're there 20 years later. It's been good in some ways for intelligence gathering purposes to be there, to monitor all these groups that are in Pakistan and Afghanistan and other parts of Asia and the Middle East that they're operating in, right? That puts us in a region where we've been able to monitor a lot of different potentially dangerous groups. Remember, Iran's right below Afghanistan, right? And they've got the nuclear program that's been ramping back up that we're trying to, restart the agreement between Iran and the United States and the international community, right? To keep them from developing a nuclear weapon. But that's ongoing. So anyway, there's some, reasons for being there, right? But they've come at too high a cost. And the cost is what? 2,000, I'm sorry. How many American lives? I got to get the number right. Killed in action in Afghanistan, 2,372. That may not be exactly right, but it's within it's pretty darn close. That's a low number, right? For having been somewhere for 20 years. I mean, we were in North Korea for like we were in Korea for 3 years. We lost about 50,000 roughly. Obviously technology's improved a lot, and our equipment and, just a lot of lessons learned. A lot fewer American soldiers are being killed, better body armor, better equipment, better planning, Like, yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome that instead of 50,000 dead, there's only 2,000 Americans dead. It's still horrible, right? That those people had to die, that we had to be there at all. We did have to get bin Laden, but we didn't need to be there for 20 years, right? And, okay, so 2,372 dead, 20,000 American wounded, right? Those wounds never fully heal. They're always there. If not physically, if they never fully physically heal. You're always going to have the scars, but on top of that, it's the psychological. That's even worse, right? And when you're talking about wounds, like it seems impersonal, but when you think about what some of these war wounds are, how truly horrific they are, it's not there are a lot of people who would rather just be dead, right? Than have to go on with some of these war wounds, and it's like, this is why you don't go to war. unless you absolutely have to, because it's not glory. It's not glorious. Like all the movies we watch and all the TV and fucking garbage. Excuse me. I apologize. Glorifying war, right? Shooting somebody without any consequences, blowing somebody up. None of this crap is even remotely realistic. Any soldier who's ever served will tell you that, right? And I haven't served, but I've talked to a lot of them. They'll almost to a person tell you first, Saving Private Ryan is probably one of the more realistic ones, but most of them are just completely unbelievable, right? How it's not anything like the real thing, right? And it's not entertainment to them. Very few vets I've ever spoken to go to see those war movies. That's not entertaining to them at all. It's either insulting or it's triggering, right? And so I think it's incumbent on us as a people and as a culture to get our shit together, excuse me again, and stop glorifying war, right? And that includes the entertainment community. I'm calling out you liberals in Hollywood right now, right? And I've loved action movies my whole life. And I told you last week that I loved, growing up, I loved John Wayne. I loved the Duke. I always looked up to him. The stories that those Westerns taught were terrible, right? And so many of us spent years or decades unlearning those ridiculous, dishonest myths about the West, right? That we were brainwashed when we were kids. But they were beautiful lies. They were entertaining lies, right? Sold by a very likable, heroic character, John Wayne. I love Clint Eastwood, right? I've always loved Clint Eastwood's movies, action movies, right? And I mean, hats off to Eastwood. He's an excellent director, and his movies, I think, are far more realistic, particularly the ones he's directed in recent years. The World War II movies, Flags of Our Fathers and the Iwo Jima one as well are just particularly, powerful. And certainly Saving Private Ryan. So there are movies that really do more justice, right, to the topic of war. But the glorification of violence, just in general, we've seen it. And this isn't a diatribe to, because I don't know this isn't a discussion about us reducing violence within the country, right? Although I think that probably could be a factor. Like if we stop glorifying violence, perhaps we'd see a drop in violence, shootings, right? Now, I'm not familiar with any credible research that supports that. I mean, I know there's some research, but nothing beyond correlational, right? To definitively say, well, if you stop, having all these violent video games, or if you reduce the amount of violent programming, that you're going to have this, causal effect that reduces violence. I haven't seen anything that proves that. That would, if that were true, I'd say, yeah, let's find a way, right? But that's the problem. Freedom of speech, freedom of expression. That's what this country's all about. That's the First Amendment. People have to be free to enjoy the entertainment they want to. So I'm not talking about imposing anything like, government restrictions or new, motion picture review boards or anything like that, like they used to have. The Motion Picture Association of America that does their rating system, right? And if you're R-rated, you can't be under 17 or whatever without a guardian or an adult, right? I don't even know if NC-17 still around or not. PG-13, all those classifications. I'm not even sure what's current anymore, but they do have those sort of the Motion Picture Association of America, and they have those sort of guidelines, and that's reasonable. I think there's movies you don't want kids to go see. It's not unless their parents say so, right? You don't want some kid just rolling in by himself to go see something just far too graphic for a child, right? So that's a responsible society looking out for children. That's not oppression, right? Oppression is, I want to go see, I want to watch the movie 1984, but the state won't let me watch it, right? I can't get it in the video store. I can't stream it online. That's a nice, real stark, obvious, but that would be a really good, clear example of the difference, that there are some reasonable limits to our consumption, but I'm not looking for anything beyond that, right? I want us to think more about, I don't want the government to impose limits on what you can watch. I don't believe in that for a second. But the idea that as a people that we start having a discussion, about not glorifying war and that as groups, as progressives, right, as Americans, we start having a very serious conversation about what can we do, right, to really, and I think we're heading in that right direction, right, that things have been getting better, things were so male dominant for centuries that, we're starting to see very rapidly, in some ways not rapidly enough, but in the scope of things, rapid changes as far as, improved human rights for a lot of people, for women, for minorities. Still a long way to go, but it's come so far from where it was 50 or 60 years ago, right? But there's also been this backlash that we see, right, from the far right and from the right who's not comfortable with all these changes. And that's a core component of conservatism, is the fear of change or the resistance to change, right? And wanting, even if you're not against change, that you want to slow it down so that it's not destructive. And there's a solid, sound argument for that type of conservatism. But the type of conservatism that we've been seeing from the Republican Party is not really conservatism at all, because one, it's not honest, right? They're not honest in their analysis. They've been ignoring all kinds of bad behavior unethical behavior from the former president. They've been dishonest about numerous arguments. They've ignored climate change, ignored all the evidence, right? They ignored all the evidence against Trump. Those are just a few minor examples. The crazy conspiracy theories that numerous, mainstream politicians have now given voice to, right? It's embarrassing us in front of the entire world. The preposterous claims that have been made by so many within the Republican Party. And a lot of these folks don't even believe it, but they're afraid to say what they really think because they're scared of their constituents, right? And they want to keep their job. They don't want to lose the next election. But a lot of them it's not just their job. They're scared for their safety. And you can see you can see why. It's understandable to some degree. When you see how Trump supporters have behaved, you can understand, right, to some degree. Now, it's a criticism of their leadership. You really have no business being a leader if you're not courageous. If you don't have the courage to lead, you shouldn't be in the job. If you don't have guts to stand up, right, to your voters, right, and you need to assume going in, there's going to be some wacko birds, right? So you have to, right? That's part of your gig. Is standing up to your constituents and standing up for them, but also standing up to them when they go too far, right? When they cross the line and behave unethically, dishonestly, criminally, that you stand up to them, right? And you draw the line, right? Regardless of whether you're Republican or Democrat, there's basic moral behavior we all have to subscribe to. Independent, doesn't matter, right? You tell a lie, you're lying, and it's like you do it or you don't. So that's kind of what we're looking at here. But the Afghanistan thing is troubling to us. The main thing about that is we want out, right? But it's the speed of the transition. We are worried about the safety of the people at the embassy, the Americans and staff there, right? But there is a plan in place for them to be evacuated if things go bad, with numerous contingencies. Still concerned about that, but and we're concerned about the loss of intelligence that we may experience for pulling out of Afghanistan. Absolutely, we're concerned about that because we're going to lose some human intelligence when we pull all our people out, or almost all of them, right? And we've got other countries there that we're working in partnership, and the Afghan military and their government, if they last, we can work with them as well. But yeah, we're going to lose some human intelligence capability. Now, as far as our signals intelligence is far superior than it was 20 years ago. So we have a whole suite of surveillance capabilities we didn't even have when we invaded Afghanistan. So we're, in a lot of ways, we have a lot of advantages and assets and resources we didn't have before, right? And even if we're not in Afghanistan, there is the potential to use our allies and to work out arrangements with them to work on our behalf, or from us to operate potentially from their countries. But a lot of that's still unclear and up in the air. And we know there are some internal things going on that we have no privileges whatsoever to. But there's all kinds of internal deliberations right now between the Biden administration and a number of countries within the region regarding the transition the very crazy violent transition that's going to take place. But our primary concern overall, the biggest thing, is the danger to civilians, primarily women and all those who've served, assisted the United States. And that's a lot of people, right? Especially when you talk about women and girls and children, and anyone else who wants to be free of Taliban domination, that we get them out, and it's impossible to get everyone out of that country. It's a big country, and it's a mountainous, rugged, violent, extremely violent country, extremely dangerous country. And one of the countries, and one of the reasons Biden's pulling out so faster than anticipated, is because Taliban's been stepping up attacks against the military. And they had every indication to believe that had we stayed like another year, that those attacks would continue to increase, right? And would only increase the violence in the country and increase the fatalities, and the wounded of the U.S. So instead of putting it off here, let's just get out now. Our problem with that is we're afraid they're going to be a bunch of civilians that get butchered. That's the biggest concern of all, right? Is that something like what happened in Vietnam will happen again, right? That there's a whole bunch of people trying to leave that can't leave. People trying to hang on to helicopters and stuff, and just tons of people not being trapped and then being murdered by the Taliban, because we chose to pull out in a hasty fashion, right? We totally understand and respect Biden wanting to get out of there. It's been 20 years we've been there, when maybe we should have been there 1 or 2. But all these wars are big business. I mean, we got to admit that. And I think a lot of time, most people, when we go into these wars, most Americans, probably most people in most places, they view it, because usually governments and states, generally present these wars as just wars justified by some certain act. Sometimes that's true. A lot of times it's not. A lot of times it's trumped up, some minor slight or misunderstanding or some disagreement, that could be worked out another way, but is ignored because somebody thinks they can take advantage if they strike right away, right? And that, then we have control of the oil, or we have control of their resources, or we have control over this waterway. And that's, we have control over this industry, or these whatever resources they might be that are prized at the time. And you can see that is at the root of most wars, is some form of conquest over people or land or materials or wealth. It's not a justifiable conflict, right? It's people trying to take more than they should have, right? Or take what they need, but do so in an unjust and arbitrary or cruel fashion. And that's what we've seen in a lot of America's wars over the years, was that it was more to protect U.S. business interests and to, boost our economy by controlling the entire Western Hemisphere, not only economically, but through a lot of military muscle and military might. And there's plenty of instances of our involvement throughout history, whether you're talking about Cuba or Puerto Rico or the Philippines or Hawaii, or Guam. I mean, all these things were taken. They were taken. We had Cuba, we gave it back, right? But a lot of these things were taken by the United States, not for the purpose of defending freedom. That was often the stated purpose, but not the actual reason for going. The actual reason for going is usually business interests. That's big money. And I mean, in truth, that's good business, right? Iraq was good business for a lot of defense contractors, right? A lot of companies who do that type of work. That's good money for them, and good money for the people that work for them, right? So that was a big boon to the economy in a lot of sectors, right? Huge, debt sucker. I mean, that the Cost of War project now estimates the cost of all the wars in the Middle East and Asia since 2001, and this is from 2019, it was at $6.4 trillion. All those conflicts, war on terror, basically the last 20 years, $6.4 trillion. That was 2 years ago. So it could be higher. It could be more. It could be closer to 7 by this point. You still think we can't come up with money to fight climate change or fix the healthcare system or, Flint's water? You still think we can't find money, right, to train teachers or police better? We just blew, over the last 20 years, $6.5 trillion, mostly on wars we didn't need to be involved with. Didn't even need to be there, right? And if involved, not to that degree and for that length, right? But it's hard. It's hard once you're in to pull yourself out, right? Because not only, there's a lot of Americans want out. They don't want their kids to get shot. They don't want their kid to get sent over there. But there's a lot of businesses who like war. It's good for their business, right? A lot of those companies benefit from war. And the fear of the enemy, the other, the terrorist, the dark-skinned Muslim who wants to destroy America. That was the big image in the early 2000s that was perpetuated by the George Bush administration and by the far right, that these were the people that were coming to kill us, right? And understandably up to a point, right? Because of the attack on the 9/11 attack, right? Those people were mostly from Saudi Arabia. We didn't attack Saudi Arabia though, right? I mean, they were from Al-Qaeda, who was based in Afghanistan, and you got bin Laden, who was in Afghanistan. That's why we went there, to get bin Laden and to get Al-Qaeda, right? Well, we did that. We got bin Laden. We degraded Al-Qaeda. And here's the thing, right? According to the Institute of War and Peace Studies, in last year, about a year and a half ago, they had a survey. And I know it's a year and a half old, but as far as I know, it's the most recent, the most accurate one. 46% of Afghans want us out. 46. And you say, well, that's not a majority. You're right, it's not. How many want us to stay? 33. A third want us to stay. Now, that's a year and a half ago. That number could have changed. We don't know. It may have. To what degree, we're not sure. Right? But as of a year and a half ago, it was 46% wanted us gone. Right? And we've had plenty of time, 20 years to win them over, 20 years to get it right, 20 years to fix it. And at this stage, 46% still want us out. We need to get out. We're not wanted there. And if we're there, that's the other thing, right? If we're there and then we're not wanted there, we're creating terrorists simply by being there. So how is that winning the war on terror? Right? As you fight the war on terror, you create more terrorists simply by being in the country where you're not wanted. And that's the same with Iraq. They didn't want us there. They never wanted us there. They were glad to have Saddam's toppled, but they wanted us to leave right away. All right? And fair enough, maybe we couldn't do that, right? We had to make sure that things were handed over properly, but we didn't do that either. We just stayed and made a bunch of money for American businesses, right? And renegotiated contracts that were advantageous to the United States and U.S. business. We stayed for years upon years, far too long, right? We had the admiration of the Iraqi people when we liberated Iraq. But the longer we stayed, the more disgust, the more resentment, the more violence, right? So we really never should have been there. We had no place. There were no threat to us, right? There was no involvement. That was a rush to war on bad intelligence. That's why you don't rush, right? There was no evidence. The evidence was so weak. They cooked the books on that analysis. It was so careless, right? And the Democrats like Hillary Clinton and John Kerry who voted to invade Iraq bear responsibility for that. They were wrong to do it. And they probably knew they were wrong at the time, but they did it because they didn't have political courage to stand up. They knew that would be an unsafe vote, that they would be heavily criticized for, that they'd be labeled as against the troops. And it was a scary time in the early 2000s. Like, if you questioned anything that the military or Bush wanted to do, most people would look at you like you were a traitor. There was a lot of pressure on you to just rally behind the flag and rally behind the president, regardless of what stupid stuff he was doing. And the right used that. Perhaps you remember how they tried to shame everyone else. Anyone else who ever questioned Bush or criticized any of his careless moves or Cheney's questionable behavior, it was like, oh, you're un-American, right? Any concern about Muslim Americans being abused, right? Tortured or unjustly surveilled, oh, you're un-American. You're with the terrorists, right? So we heard all that nonsense, and we see where all that got us, right? That, it's cost us a lot more than it's been worth, right? And had we avoided all those wars, we'd have somewhere between $6.5 and $7 trillion to spend to take care of our families and our communities that we don't have because we were busy killing people with it instead. So, we need defense. We need a strong military. There's no question about that. But we need smart power. We need to do things a smart way. And Afghanistan wasn't done smartly. And Iraq sure as hell wasn't done smartly at all. Right? And, it's that kind of money. You got to look at the long-term expenses. It's not just, it's all the years you're going to pay for those veterans who served. You're going to pay for them, their benefits, their health care for the rest of their lives. Yeah. So we hope there's a good plan in place to get all those folks out. We don't know how that's even remotely possible. We're very, very fearful and truly terrified that civilians, too many Afghans, a lot of Afghan civilians, any one is too many, right? But they're going to be butchered by the Taliban. We hope there's some plan in place, secret plan in place we're not aware of to prevent that. But that is we want out of Afghanistan. We just think the withdrawal is too soon and it's too precipitous. It's too disorderly. That leave when you can get everybody out, right? And I know they want to protect U.S. troops, but I do feel like we do have an obligation to those civilians. I think a moral obligation. It's a tough call. But yeah, we would like to see a longer withdrawal. I guess we're in that camp for people who wanted another year. I understand why you didn't want to give it another year, but at least another however long it takes for a more orderly withdrawal, because we just don't see it happening. And we hope like hell we're wrong. We hope there's some stuff they got going on, and Biden and the military and intelligence community working out there, that they've got some stuff cooking that'll take care of business, and it's going to work out. But we are fearful that it's going to be quite horrific, and that we're just leaving too soon, right? That we need to give them more time to get as many people out as we can, and a little more time to try and shore up the Afghan government. It may be that another 5 or 10 years wouldn't make any difference, and it's going to fall either way. But at least get the innocents out, as many as we can. As many as we can, you'll never get to all of them, but as many as you not in that crazy remote mountainous region, but get to as many of them as you can and get them out. So that's our primary concern there. Other than that, we're glad as hell to be getting out of Afghanistan. We do think it creates more terrorists than it actually. Here's the other thing too, right? Okay, I didn't mention this, right? I mentioned how many U.S. were killed and wounded, but according to the Cost of War Project at Watson Institute at Brown University, 71,000 civilians have been killed in Afghanistan and Pakistan, right? Because we've been active across the border and well into Afghanistan at certain times as well, and into Pakistan as well, deeply. And when we got bin Laden, that civilians killed in those two countries since the start of the war has been 71,000 civilians killed. Afghan and Pakistan civilians killed as a result of fighting. And I think 40%, I believe, of the people killed by the United States are killed by aircraft. And that means either bombers, attack planes, or drones, right? Which is safer for us, right, to bomb people, right? We see these low death numbers for our guys, only 2,372 killed, right? And part of that is facilitated by not just better body armor and planning and weapons, but also, better aircraft, right? More precise aircraft, better armaments in the skies, right? As precise as they are, they're still killing a ton of civilians, right? And when you kill those civilians, you create new terrorists, right? That's why we've got to be a lot more serious and a lot more critical about staying out of conflicts unless they're absolutely necessary, right? Because this country has a lot of enemies. There's a lot of people in the Philippines who still hate us for what we did, 200 years ago. They still hate us, for what we did or say like more like 120 some years ago. The Philippines, a lot of resentment in Hawaii, right? Because we just took that. They didn't have any choice about it. And you can talk to the locals there, and a lot of locals in Hawaii view themselves very differently from the rest of the United States, and some of them, almost don't even acknowledge. I won't say that's true about most Hawaiians, but you definitely feel the cultural independence there, right? And the awareness of how they were brought into the Union. It was not done democratically at all. They basically just sailed a naval ship up to it and said, this is what you're going to do. Sign these papers here, or, we've got this, this destroyer here for a reason. They didn't have any choice. That's how we got Puerto Rico. We got that from the Spanish-American War, which was just a trumped-up war. I don't go into this too much longer, but that was presented as a war for freedom, but it was just a naked, conquest of, the Spanish territories that Spain was still holding at the time, including Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines. This was our chance, right, to kick Spain out of the Western Hemisphere and take their property, which we did. But we did so under the guise of making it safe for democracy, which we weren't remotely concerned about at all after we took over those countries. We proceeded to rule them pretty dictatorially, in favor of business, of course, right? So anyway, that's our concern with Afghanistan. So we're going to end it on there. Overall, we're very happy with Biden, but we did list out a number of concerns. We hope he'll take those seriously, and especially for the Afghan people, get as many of the civilians out of there as he can, and all the people who've worked with the United States. They've done us a service. We should certainly prioritize them, and all those who've worked with us, they should be getting out because they would certainly be targeted first, right? And targeted for extreme brutality. There was more I want to talk about. I'm going to skip it tonight. I'm going to save it for the next time. I'm cognizant of the time. It's almost 2 hours now. I don't want to ramble quite as long as I did last time, but we did cover a lot of really good ground. I'm really happy about it. So our next episode, all right, we've come to that point. We're at the end of the show. Our next episode is going to be about climate change. Talked about it a little bit, but we're going to delve in. We're going to talk about the situation we're in right now, how we got there, what we need to do to keep the climate from warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So since the Industrial Revolution, human activity has increased the global temperature by 1 degree Celsius. Human activity being all the methane and CO2, not just CO2, but methane as well, into the atmosphere that has contributed to global warming and to climate change. Most of that occurring, the increase in CO2 as well as the drastic effects of climate change happening within the past 50 years, right? The most pronounced effects of climate change just happening in the past recent years. Originally, the International Panel on Climate Change, which is organized by the UN, the Committee on Climate Change, the IPCC, they had initially said that they thought that we would, so that's the limit. We don't want to get past 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level because from all of their calculations, that is when things get truly catastrophic. We don't want to go past 1.5 degrees, and we've only got 0.5 degrees to go, right? And probably not even less than that now. Because they've already come out with another report saying we may actually, the previous analysis from the IPCC found that we were going to hit that 1.5 degrees threshold somewhere between like 2032 and 2050 or something like that. That's changed. They've revised those numbers. Global warming has increased since then, and now they're looking, we may hit that limit in 5 years. It may be 5 years that we hit the 1.5 degree threshold, right? That's when storms start getting worse, drought starts getting much worse, exponentially so the higher it gets, right? And so 1.5 is supposed to be the absolute cutoff, that we never exceed that. And basically, I got to stop talking about this, but basically, the effects of climate change that we're seeing now are going to be around with us for hundreds of years. We're not going to be able to reverse them. Maybe minimize them a little bit, maybe, right? But more than anything is stop the warming so it doesn't get any worse, right? And we're not even going to be able to stop. We're not going to be able to stop it from getting 1.5. I doubt. Maybe. It'll be tough. If we could stop it at 1.5, then we can, but we've got to take the right measures. It won't be as bad as it could be. It'll probably be worse than now, but not as catastrophic as it would become past that. So we're going to talk about all of that, how dire it is, how serious it is, how this is basically between voting rights and protecting our democracy and climate change. These are the two most important priorities, right? Because if no voting rights, there's no democracy. It's over. We no longer have rule over a country. It's done. It's an authoritarian state, right? If we don't have voting rights, we don't have that. If you can't vote, if you can't have free and fair elections, not a democracy, game over, right? It's like, if you can't have that, climate change has reached such a dire situation that humanity could become extinct within a matter of decades or, a century or so, but perhaps even less, right? That things are getting worse than we thought, sooner than we thought. So we're going to talk all about that, what specifically we need to do, what are the specific steps, policies, measures, right, that are going to reduce our carbon output to the point, reduce or eliminate our carbon output to where we know we hit the 1.5 degrees Celsius target and we do not exceed it, that we don't go past that. Or ideally, that we don't even hit the 1.5, if that's possible. Right now, it's not looking good. So we're going to talk a lot more about that on the next episode of The Breakdown. I thank you for sticking with me tonight. It's a lot of stuff, but I like to draw the connections. They are all interrelated. We're going to talk a lot more about those things, but we are going to stay focused for a little while on singular topics. So the next breakdown, we're just talking about climate change and nothing else. Maybe a few things related to it, but we're going to keep it really, really focused on climate change. And we've got some other cool shows in the works getting planned, but I'm not going to tell you anything yet. But yeah, we've got some other stuff cooking as well in the kitchen. So more to come on that. Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed this show. I hope you enjoyed it too. I look forward to us talking again soon. Again, take care of yourselves. Take care of your families. Live with honor. Stay courageous. And I'll talk to you again soon. Take care.